We'll be discussing the parsha of Vayera. That's this week's parsha. It'll be based on Rabbi Tatz's shir called Kindness. We'll be discussing the story of Sodom and Sodom and Gomorrah. So Rabbi Tatz says this is a little bit strange that Sodom and Gomorrah deserved such a terrible punishment. What was their punishment after all? They were wiped out in a cataclysmic fireball, right? They were completely eradicated right off the face of the earth. Now this is very unusual to mete out such harsh punishment. After all, what were they guilty of? I mean, according to last week's parsha, they were extremely cruel, right? According to this week's parsha, that too is very clear, right? From the events itself, right? When the two angels go to, want to destroy Sodom and want to save Lot, and Lot takes them in as guests. This is literally in the Chumash, right? In the parsha itself. The people of Sodom came to congregate all of them to do terrible things to them, to these guests. So, the angels are almost vindicated in their destruction of Sodom. Fine. So, even though that's true, that they were so terrible, and Rabbi Tatz brings a midrash that there's a lady who actually hosted strangers in Sodom, right? The Sodom and the surrounding cities were extremely unwelcoming of strangers. And if anyone hosted them, like this lady, then what did they do to her? They took her, they stripped her, they covered her in honey, they tied her to the roof and let bees sting her to death. So not only is it cruel, but it's creatively cruel, which makes things worse. So that's how they treat people. And given that this is true, that they did all these terrible things, Rabbi Tatz's question is, then why later on in the Navi, right, in Tanakh, does he say that the reason why Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed was because they didn't give tzedakah, because they didn't give charity, didn't help poor people? That's very bizarre. Look at all the terrible things they were doing. After all, in Torah, so there are two different types of mitzvah, right? There's positive mitzvahs, like honoring your parents, or remembering the Shabbat, right? Doing Kiddush, giving tzedakah, right? V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, right? Loving your neighbor as yourself. And then there are negative mitzvahs, right? Like not eating non-kosher, not mixing milk and meat, not stealing, not killing. These are all things we're familiar with, right? Now, when you do a positive mitzvah, right? When you put on tefillin, when you honor your parents, you're building spiritual worlds, right? You're creating positive energy, not positive energy, you're literally creating spiritual worlds. You're doing something positive for the world. When you transgress a negative mitzvah, let's say you eat non-kosher food, you steal something, then you're destroying spiritual worlds. Now, based on this principle, we can understand that a person then this is true, by the way, halachically, that a person who transgresses a negative mitzvah is much worse. The punishment is much worse for someone who fails to do a positive commandment. Now, we want you to put on tefillin, we want you to honor your parents and to make Kiddush on Shabbat, right? These are all positive actions that create worlds. But refraining from creating isn't nearly as bad as actively destroying, which is what happens when you transgress a negative mitzvah. So, given that that's true, how can we understand this mysterious Navi? Why is the reason that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed was because they failed to give tzedakah, which is a positive mitzvah, which is certainly bad, but not nearly as bad as the fact that they were torturing and killing people who came to visit, to come to visit their town. How is that not worse? So, as an analogy, Rabbi Tatz gives the following: imagine you hire a maid. Right? There are two situations. You hire a maid. She's supposed to come at 8 and leave at 5. She comes a little late, leaves a little early. When she gets there, she gets to work. She does a good job. Next day, she comes back, so on and so forth. And then after some time, you realize, as the employer and homeowner, that some things are missing. And somehow you find out that she's the one who is taking them. So what do? Now, you actually have a few options, right? You can either fire her, right? Release her. Or you could confront her. Like, hey, look, I know you're stealing things. Please give them back if you want to continue working. Or suffer the consequences. Or you could simply just, be like, fine, whatever what she took. Just take the valuables that would otherwise tempt her and just hide them so that temptation doesn't arise, right? You can do that. Now, what happens if you have a maid who's supposed to work at 8, never comes late, supposed to leave at 5, never leaves early, she never steals, never does anything negative, but from the moment she gets there to the moment she leaves, she sits on a chair and does nothing. She does this the first day. She does this the second day. So what do? You fire her. Why? She's not contributing anything. Her output is zero. This was what the problem was with the Sodom and Gomorrah. Were they doing terrible actions? Yes, they're doing terrible actions. Would they be punished? They would most certainly be punished. But at the end of the day, God also needs to see, it's true, you're destroying my world, but are you also contributing? Are you building things? Because if you're building things, then we could deal with some of the negativity, right? They're like, look, if you're contributing negatively, at least I'm getting something from you, right? You have some redeeming qualities. I want you around at least for the things that you're contributing. But Sodom was doing nothing. They wouldn't give tzedakah. That's what the Navi, he didn't mean literally. The only thing they weren't doing wasn't giving tzedakah. It's almost like a call-all, an all-inclusive for any positive mitzvahs. Sodom and Gomorrah were not contributing positively to the world. And if you're in a relationship with somebody, the reason why you engage in a relationship with somebody is because of the positive things they have, right? They may have no negative meter, right? They may never criticize you or yell at you or treat you poorly. But if they never go out of their way for you and want to show you how much they care, then there's nothing there at the end of the day, right? And that's why we see that Sodom and Gomorrah were completely wiped out. God didn't need them. He's like, why are you in my world? You're contributing nothing to it. And therefore he wiped them out. Have a good Shabbos.